This evening's lecture by Cameron Silver is entitled Decades, a Century of Fashion, and is presented in conjunction with the current exhibition at the Ulrich, Coded Couture. As a museum celebrating modern and contemporary art, we look to engage our audiences with timely, innovative, and thought-provoking exhibitions and programs that resonate with the work of artists across the globe. Fashion at the crossroads of art and technology is very much of the moment, with two major recent exhibitions recently presented in New York and Boston. Manos ex machina, Fashion in the Age of Technology, was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Costume Institute in spring 2016. It explored how fashion designers are reconciling the handmade with the machine-made in the creation of haute couture and avant-garde ready-to-wear. Also this spring and summer, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston presented #Textile that explored how the synergy between fashion and technology is not only changing the way designers design, but also the way people interact with their clothing. Coded Couture, presented at the Ulrich through December 4, opened during New York Fashion Week this past February. Drawing on the disciplines of computer coding, art, biology, and design, 10 international artist designers investigate how technology and personal expression can merge to provide individualized couture garments and accessories. Coded Couture was organized by the Department of Exhibitions, Pratt Institute, Brooklyn, New York, and was curated by Ginger Greg Dugan and Judith Hoos Fox of C2 Curator Squared. Presentations of such timely exhibitions and internationally renowned speakers is only possible through significant private support. The Ulrich presentation of Coded Couture is sponsored by Norma Griever, the Gridley Family Foundation, the Keacha family, Lee and Ron Starkle, and Keith and Georgia Stevens. Additional support is provided by Genevieve and Chris Farha, Vincent Farha, Tony and Bud Gates, Liz and Bob Workman, Patrick Hebkirk and Dean Bradley, Sonia Gredeman and Chris Bruner, Trish Higgins, Bonnie and Richard Honeyman, Monica and James Schmidt, and Aspen Boutique. And we never thank our donors enough, so please join me in thanking them now. This evening we have the opportunity to place the fashion of tomorrow within the context of the past 10 decades. We're extremely fortunate that Jana Durfee, Ulrich Museum educator, has some pretty impressive contacts in the fashion world and was able to persuade Cameron Silver to visit Wichita.
Thank you, Jana.
Yes, thank you, Jana. Cameron Silver is fashion director of the H Halston and H by Halston brand. As a global celebrity stylist, international best-selling author, and fashion expert regularly appearing on shows such as Good Morning America and CBS This Morning, he's widely recognized as a fashion and style authority. Cameron is also the founder of Decades, an acclaimed vintage retail store in Los Angeles, worshipped by fashionistas and collectors alike for an unparalleled collection of designer clothing and accessories dating from the 1920s to today. In 2012, he published the global best-selling book, Decades, A Century of Fashion, and has written for publications including Harper's Bazaar and C Magazine. Cameron also starred in the Bravo television show Dukes of Melrose, which profiled his store Decades. Named one of, this is my favorite, named one of Time Magazine's 25 most influential names and faces in fashion. He has styled celebrities from major red carpet appearances, including the Golden Globes, Academy Awards, and consulted for fashion and industry brands around the world. That's quite an epitaph, you know. Pretty brilliant, yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm Wichita welcome to Cameron Silver.
Well, thank you. Hello, Wichita. It's been nice mingling with everybody the last 24 hours. I am delighted to be the warm-up act for tonight's debate. I will promise you that you will be home in time to watch the debate live. The pundits who are speaking now have nothing new to say. They've been saying the same things about the debate for the last 2 or 3 weeks. So I'm very happy you guys are all here. And it's nice to be in Wichita, which is really the center of America, literally, but has no nonstop flights to New York. So I don't know what that's all about. And it's also the private aircraft, this is like the airplane capital of the world. So anyway, I got a ride out of here tomorrow. I always say that I have very kind of Midwestern, well, this is my sort of spiel that's always been like, I have East Coast shopping habits, or spending habits, West Coast eating habits, but my values are very Midwestern. So it's nice to be in the most mid of Midwest, and I never thought I'd come to Kansas, but here I am. So thank you for having me. Before I kind of talk about the history of fashion, I'll just give you a little bit of a brief background about me. So in 1997, I opened a store called Decades. It's been almost 20 years, which is kind of horrific to think about how long I've been in retail. I mean, I always say 20 years ago and 20 pounds ago. And it was a time in Los Angeles where sort of glamour had disappeared. It had become, if you think about what fashion looked like in the mid-90s, it was very minimal, it wasn't exciting. Red carpets really didn't have that much power. There were no stylists. I mean, a celebrity would go to Giorgio at that time, or Charles Gallet, some of the stores that existed, and buy their clothes and go to an event. But suddenly when Decades opened, it was sort of in tandem with this re-triggering of how the power of celebrity was being recognized, because all of a sudden luxury brands had red carpet wranglers, and celebrities hired stylists. So this all happened at the same time, and we were part of that wave of a kind of glamorous renaissance. I kind of call it the 21st, it was sort of, not that it was on the eve of the 21st century, but really the 21st century's version of the studio system. So it's been amazing to be in business for 20 years. As I was talking to some of the fellow retailers here, it doesn't get better, it gets worse, it gets harder. But it has enabled me to really interact with people all over the world. And the book came out in 2012, and it's taken me to Beirut, Lebanon, it's taken me to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and now I'm happy to add Wichita, Kansas to my book tour. So let's begin. The 1900s. Seems like such a long time ago. But look at this dress, the classic Sergeant Madame X. Now, some of you may know that when Sargent originally painted this, the right strap fell off the shoulder. That was the original version of the painting. It was so scandalous that he adjusted the painting to give you a more classic strap treatment. But if you look at that dress, this dress that's, basically 100 years old, it is completely contemporary today. And that's one of the things that I like to stress with fashion, is that I like to look at vintage in a very modern way. And it's also extremely liberating for you as consumers if you start buying things thinking about the timelessness of your investment. So that dress, we will see variations of it on red carpets probably till the end of time. And here's a dress. It's also, this amazing corseted dress. This could be Zac Posen. I mean, for those of you who are fashion lovers, this idea of this bodycon dress. Did you guys watch the Emmys? I mean, I miss the Emmys. I was on QVC, but I'm sure that they were fun. But you think about that kind of bodycon dress, and even the fetishing of that shoulder treatment. This is provocative to look at today. And I think you realize how great fashionistas aren't afraid to sort of step outside of the box and take a risk. So here we've got, a beautiful example of pre-Raphaelite art. And my book really looks at each decade and looks at dualities. And the romance of this really reminds me a little bit of what we see in people like Dries Van Noten or Marnie or Heider Ackerman, the idea of these sort of unexpected color pairings, and this idea of this sort of kimono opera coat is something that we see variations of it decade to decade. It's even when I went to Saudi Arabia, we talked about the abaya, and when this picture came up, and it was really kind of historic to have me in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, to be speaking about fashion, and a lot of the talk had to be censored, so not every picture could be shown, but I said, look at this. This is the abaya. This is not so different from how traditional dress is in Saudi Arabia. So this is Eleanor Nesbit, and would you, you kind of look at this. This is like a Tinder profile picture when you think about it. I mean, it is. What is it like? It scroll up. How does it? What's the thing you say when you like it? Swipe up or swipe right. So would you swipe right for Eleanor Nesbit? So I mean, look. So I mean, this is a very provocative image when you think about it. I mean, she's gazing into the camera. She's got this off-the-shoulder garment that is extremely romantic looking. That idea of kind of variation of peasant wear, which we see season to season, but the confidence. So whether it's Tinder or Grindr or whatever your app is, I mean, this would get a reaction. And speaking of reactions, we saw the romance of the pre-Raphaelite image. Now look at the romance of Poiret, and this is the Poiret posse, where you see the Oriental inspiration in the garments, this sort of eclectic way of dressing. This is what I would call street style. You think about it. We didn't have street style photographers in the same way in the 1900s, but this is an image where you would be captivated to see women like this, be it today or 100 years ago. And speaking of Poiret, here's an image of Poiret. Really the man who kind of created the idea of the celebrity designer. And like all great designers, he wasn't necessarily the most technical designer. I mean, you can see as evidenced by that, there's someone else who does all the work. But Poiret, like so many designers who followed him thereafter, had an incredible personality, knew how to play the press, knew about celebrity placement, dressing influential women, created fragrances named after his children, had events that that you wanted to be a part of his orbit. And I think still to this day, quite often we want to buy clothes to be part of that dream. I think that's what luxury is all about. And this is an example of a Babani piece. Babani, like Poiret, really played around with Orientalism in clothing. So, think about Klimt. It's so textile. The hair is so modern. So you look at this image from the 1910s, this beautiful coat that if you saw at Bergdorf Goodman today, you would pine to buy. I mean, it's so elaborate, the textile. It's a fashion image. And, when we think of portraiture, we have to really think about how they were important documents of fashion. And this is really modern. I mean, obviously, anyone who had Klimt paint them was sort of a very progressive thinker when you look at the Lady in Gold. But this is a phenomenal example of modern dressing 100 years ago. And here we have, now I want you to remember this image because it is sort of boho chic. And we're in the 1910s, and when we get to the 70s, we're going to see a very similar image. And we're also going to see another example of Fortuny dressing. But I love how this is like how we want to live. That kind of boho chic with the wallpaper, the throw over the couch, the Fortuny, the long strand necklace. It's this eclectic, romantic, bohemian way of dressing. And here we have Isadora Duncan in what I would say is really an example of goddess dressing. This perennial image that happens, every decade there's a goddess moment. There's always a one-shoulder moment. There's always a Grecian goddess moment. There's always a boho moment. But here, the idea of this sort of very geometric striping of the bed and then this free way of dressing. I mean, think about how in the 1910s, most women weren't that liberated. There still was very restricted dressing, but because of the art world and the dance world, you have this very free way of dressing. And speaking of free, this is Poiret's wife, who was punk rock, if ever there was punk. I mean, the hair is spiked. The skirt is monkey fur. The top, this lame halter. I mean, if you saw someone wearing that, you'd be like, what a freak. And that's what Poiret really had in this amazing wife who was so engaging and she would turn people's heads. So models and muses are such integral parts of a designer's creativity. So this is Mata Hari way before Madonna. So the idea of the bra top is not something that was Like a Virgin 1980s, of which I saw at the antique store on Douglas. There was a copy of an LP of Like a Virgin. I almost bought it because Madonna's wearing something kind of similar, the idea of this exposed bra. But the secrets that bra held, literally. And who's wearing a bra tonight? Speaking of bras. Okay. Well, the woman who designed this dress, Lucille, is really responsible for the modern bra. And she was also really interested in these sort of lingerie aspects of fashion. So if you look at the trim of this dress, and we don't know who the model is, I think she's absolutely exquisite. But the idea of innerwear as outerwear was something that Lucille really proposed. I mean, she actually proposed actual functional innerwear to support a woman with the proper bra. But the lingerie trim that is so common, if you look at Dolce & Gabbana every season, those romantic details of Alberta Ferretti, all of those things are really due to what Lucille did 100 years ago. So we have a close-up of a 1920s Poiret party dress, classic flapper dress. And by the way, you guys are encouraged to interrupt me, throw panties, bundles of wheat, because this is, because wheat is very big around here, even though I don't eat it. Who's gluten-free in the audience? That's part of my West Coast eating habits. So this is Mrs. Morehouse in two, I guess, of her best side. The dress on the right-hand side is Louise Boulanger. The sequin dress with the swag is Chanel. And I have this in the book because one of the things I always espouse is that there's one way how you enter a room, but there's also how you exit a room. And I even talk about this on QVC. I always say, you want to look chic when you walk in, but when you leave, you want to give them something. So I think this is the example of drama from the front and the back. Fashion is 360 degrees. We have to think of it. Now, we all have our better sides, and maybe Mrs. Morehouse's best sides were her back, but she understood the drama that she could get from the back. Now, I choose icons in the book that are sort of women who represent the decade, and Josephine Baker in this incredible dress that looks like what we see on a red carpet again every season. It could be Badgley Mischka. It could be Versace, because Donatella and before, when her brother Gianni was designing, would always play around with charmeuse and crystal trim. So this is this modern image that's from the 20s. So we'll keep talking about modernity. When I open Decades, I always said we're a vintage that looks modern. I like my vintage clothes to look modern, and I want my modern clothes to look like the 21st century. So anyone have any idea who this actress is? Greta Garbo. It is Greta Garbo, and this is the coat that everybody always says, where can I find that coat? Because it's this gorgeous ombre with fox trim. This could be Sonia Rykiel. That idea of knit dressing, this perfect coat, this gorgeous ombre technique. I mean, we see ombre decade after decade. Halston famously played around with ombre trim. So Coco Chanel. everything we see her wearing or on her model, you could wear today. I mean, it's kind of amazing when you think about what Karl Lagerfeld does nearly 100 years later, are variations of the sort of boyfriend sweater, elongated cardigan, the pearls, the hat, even her boyish haircut. This is radical. So when you think about the impact this image has had for nearly 100 years. And it's also fascinating that Lagerfeld really pays such a strong homage to the Chanel, the Coco Chanel DNA. So the Fair Isle sweater, that elongated cardigan, the idea of knit dressing, we see it a little bit in Garbo's image, but knit dressing is so essential for how women still dress today. And it was something that, the idea, I don't want to call it easy care, but it was easy to wear. It was figure flattering. And I think that's why Chanel and this way of knit dressing is still so profound. This is a 30s bias cut detail. So this is a V&A dress that is this exquisite pleated lame with the beautiful halter neckline. So about 10 years, throughout my entire career, I've done a lot of luxury brand consulting for everybody from Hermes, Allure Piana, Boucheron, Pringles, Samsonite. But one of the most joyous projects for me was working with the French brand Azzaro, which was sort of like the French Halston in the 60s and 70s, but the brand had sort of disappeared and died. And I was involved with the revival of the brand, taking it from nothing to something. And Mr. Azzaro always played with pleated lame in the 70s and 80s. And I love that, we look at this V&A image and we see that things haven't changed that much. I mean, that was the beauty of what V&A did also with the bias cut. It's something that we see reference season after season. And speaking about reference season after season, I mean, Marlene Dietrich, it's Annie Hall before Annie Hall. I think sometimes we forget that Diane Keaton image, which was really the image, I remember seeing Annie Hall, I think it was 1977 that it came out, and my parents took me to see every film. I saw so many inappropriate films as a child. But I remember the next day going to, there's a famous store in LA called Fred Siegel, and I was kind of in the Annie Hall look. I wore a little white shirt, and the tie was a little low, and I had a vest and pleated khakis and a little fedora, and everybody, I was 8 years old, was or 7 years old, going, oh, you're so cute, you're so cool, and that's what made me fall in love with fashion, but realize that inspiration was really Dietrich. So Dietrich is Annie Hall. And when we think about boho, I mean, Frida Kahlo, this idea of the statement necklace, the ethnic textiles. And then what I always find so fascinating about this picture is look at her hands. She's so manicured. We always think about, the mustache or the unibrow, sort of the masculine features of the body hair. But truthfully, she was ultra feminine. I mean, that is such a Barbara Streisand kind of manicure. So she was extremely feminine. This is still a way everyone dresses. I mean, there still are so many businesses that are built around these sort of variations of kind of ethnic folkloric dressing. Now, this is one of my favorite dresses. It's a German costume. We don't know that much about the film or that much about the actress, but if you think about Alexander McQueen, this dress, when I first saw it, I was like, this is McQueen. This is the future of fashion, this incredible hardware. It's phenomenal. A dress like this today by McQueen in ready-to-wear would be $20,000 or $30,000. If you go to haute couture, it's $100,000. So it's really exquisite. And continuing to talk about knitwear design, this was designed by the costume designer who did most of Alfred Hitchcock films. And I love the modernity. First of all, I'm a big fan of a long sleeve dress, a sexy long sleeve dress is so chic. But all the ruffle detail, did you guys pay a little attention to the Milan shows that just happened? There were a lot of ruffles on shoulders. Ferragamo did it. So this idea of these ruffle moments are constantly happening. I think it's such an exquisite, elegant dress. Side boob is not This is side boob before there was Hollywood tape. I mean, think about that. If a woman were to wear that dress today, you know that on E's fashion pundit show, they would talk about, look at her side boob. How could she show so much side boob? So, this is side boob before boob jobs, too. That's a great boob. If you've got a boob like that, side it. But the dress is gorgeous. So this is a look by Mam Boucher, who was a big lover of total look dressing. And because there's a nonstop from Wichita to Chicago, opening at the Chicago Historic Museum will be a Mam Boucher exhibit, because he was originally from Chicago. Mam Boucher, or Mainbacher, was the first American designer to become part of the French haute couture, and famously dressed Wallace Simpson. Now, when we talk about total look, I mean, think about it. It's the gloves, it's the hat, it's the dress, it's the belt, and we're going to see a return to total look when we get into the 60s, because Rudi Gernreich eventually plays around with the idea of the total look. So I encourage everybody. I think the exhibition opens in Chicago on the 21st. I will be on QVC, and I'm missing it, sadly. But Mam Boucher is one of the brands that's currently possibly going to be relaunched. So a lot of these fabled historic brands have a great renaissance, even decades after the designer is gone, or decades after production, because there is a sort of sexiness to a fabled DNA. Even though most of us may not know Mam Boucher, when you start to tell the story about Mam Boucher, and American goes to France, dresses Wallace Simpson, that's why there's a constant interest in resurrecting old brands. And that's something I find very fascinating. Speaking of old brands, this is a detail of a Jacques Fat from the 1940s. And this is not an ad for the Gap, though it would look really cool. The Gap wishes they were so cool right now. I mean, if you're a sort of news junkie or a stock junkie, Gap is having a very hard time. But Gap basically became famous for a variation of this sort of Rosie the Riveter dressing, this sort of can-do way of dressing, this very, I would say, democratic style of dressing. And we think about the great women who entered the workforce and helped us win a war. So these women look super. Two women wartime workers looking so chic. Maybe they're in Wichita. Where are they? Because it's a plane. Yeah, this could be this. By the way, in my book, Louise Brooks is in it. So so there is a Wichita moment in my book. This is not a Wichita moment. Does anyone know who this is? Anyone ever watch The Munsters? That's Yvonne DiCarlo. So, and in a bikini. A lot of people think about the bikini not so much as being a 40s innovation, but it started to gain traction controversially, very controversially in the 1940s. And when we talk about the power of a designer and an actress, probably one of the great collaborations was Gilbert, Adrian, and Joan Crawford. He created a look for her that made her into an icon, that made it possible for Faye Dunaway to play her in a larger-than-life way, because that's what he did. He brought the shoulder pad into this sort of kind of small woman's torso and made her look larger-than-life on screen. And my mom is very thankful for that, because my mom still wears shoulder pads. 40s, well, she wasn't really wearing shoulder pads in the 40s, but certainly did in the 80s, and still likes to sew them into everything she wears. But it was a spectacular collaboration, much in the same way that, in the next decade you have Audrey Hepburn and Givenchy. Adrian also did a lot of private designing for women, and it was a time when a costume designer was a celebrity. It's very rare today to see a film get that much attention for the costume design. I mean, there'll be influence, but you don't see contemporary costume designers like a Colleen Atwood or an Ariane Phillips or a Michael Kaplan become household names. Adrian was a household name. You would want to see a film as much for Joan Crawford as you would for Adrian. And something that's always puzzled me about Hollywood is that it was a very magical relationship, the idea of a costume designer becoming a fashion designer and creating additional revenue, ultimately possibly for the studio. So, studios have been playing around a little bit with that, doing these capsule thematic collections, but there really hasn't been a costume designer to become a household name. I mean, now it's really the stylists who are much better known. So this dress, every time I go into a vintage store, somebody says, oh, in the back room, I've got the original Rita Hayworth dress. It's sort of like, but that strapless dress. Now, the strapless dress was something that actually Mambochet is credited for developing. But this is the perfect dress. This is the dress every woman needs to have in her closet. There are certain things that I'm constantly asked, like, what do I need to have in my closet? I'm like, you always need a little black dress. You need something appropriate to meet the Pope or go to a funeral. That's where, like, it's a skirt suit. I like the idea of that 11th hour invitation to a gala, that Cinderella moment you have. I'm always amazed by how women, so often don't have that garment. Now, I know you do because you've got a good vintage collection, but this is like one of those perfect dresses you want to have in your closet. And speaking of perfect dresses, this is Madame Gres. So you saw the Isadora Duncan, beautiful image that's from 30 years earlier. This is that continuation of that goddess moment of dressing. And we're going to see this goddess moment in 10 years on Grace Kelly. So the pleated jersey, this is something that you can wear today. I hope when people see this presentation or buy the book, it's that, I want that now. And when you have that knowledge of the past, you really buy the present a lot better. So this is an image of a Claire Mcardle design. Now, people are always like, well, why do you, we have several Claire Mcardle images in the book, but I chose this design where the model is just wearing a scarf, and it's kind of revealing, because Claire Mcardle really liberated women's dressing. She kind of created what became American sportswear. She created fashion that was both affordable but super chic. I mean, maybe a Claire Mcardle dress was $30, where a European dress was $300. Extremely collectible, but one of the things I love about the idea of liberation is that you really see it in this very provocative image from the 1940s. And speaking of devices, the compact was the iPhone. I mean, think about that. That's what you did when you wanted to, get a little distracted. A woman had a compact. So, replace that compact with the iPhone 7 Plus. Is that what I just ordered that I'm waiting to get? The bag may or may not be Mark Cross. The coat I think is Skunk Fur and Jacques Fott. That, interestingly enough, that idea of a statement bag color. I love the black and white, the sort of neutrality, and then you have this bold colored bag. I think it's very on trend. So this is a designer that most people don't know, but her name was Valentina. And Valentina was a Russian immigrant who, when she came to New York, kind of set it on fire. Well, literally, because she was known for wearing hats to the theater that would have kind of smoke coming out of them. She famously dressed Greta Garbo and shared her husband with Greta Garbo. She also was more successful than the better-known Charles James. So Valentina created transformative clothing. So the skirt that she's wearing right now, that apron, it was designed in such a way that it could be unhooked, unfastened, and then it would become like a more dramatic train on the back. So she was extremely innovative with fashion, extremely savvy with press. She knew how to work a room, and sort of like how I am. Like, I found out who has an airplane in this room. That was my goal. Like, who's got the airplane? But well, everyone has an airplane. Hello, it's like Cessna City, but she really understood the power of press and presence, and her clothes were astronomical. Think about it, in the 1940s, spending $5,000 on a Valentina garment. but largely forgotten, had a very short span. Very little clothing of hers has sort of survived. And I like forgotten designers. I mean, that's one of the things that I love about decades, or I love about traveling, is learning about something I didn't know about. So this is a Christian Dior dress that's called the Palomir, or Palomire. And of course, Palomir has been in the news like crazy because of everything that's happened in the Middle East. And this was, you know, and Palomir is, I think, finally has been liberated, but was a treasure, an Islamic treasure trove. And Christian Dior named the dress the Palomir. He never traveled there, so he never got to see the area. But I love that the kind of the mystery of Palomir and the fact that it's in the Bible influenced this dress. And here is a great and fantastic mix of Dior dresses. We see sort of like this safari look. We see, you know, the classic, that emerald green dress is just perfect. The little black dress, the white coat, the peach dress with the train, of course, the iconic Venus dress on the ladder. There is nothing here that you couldn't sell anywhere and have be current and complementary. I mean, maybe you'd lose the walking stick or something, but you know, that safari jacket that Dior does, suddenly Yves Saint Laurent comes to Dior at a certain point, and then he makes the safari his own. So we don't know who this woman is. We don't know what she's wearing. The image kind of reminds me of something my mother wore in 1982, which is why I put it in. But I love the necklace and that idea that a bold piece of jewelry, it's another thing, like, don't be afraid of strong accessories. The necklace is likely Coppola Topo, the Italian jeweler who was famous for working in the 1960s with Emilio Pucci, but that statement necklace, it's still such a perennial investment. So we were talking about goddess dressing. So this is Grace Kelly in a dress that was originally a Madame Grey design, because we've had it at Decades, but of course got appropriated by many costume designers and designers thereafter. But it is the perfect goddess dress. It's the perfect wedding dress. What's so interesting about the dress is, notice how the waist comes in, but the hip gets exaggerated. And when we had this dress at Decades, there were so many women who would try it on like, oh, I look hippie. Because we have sort of this attitude that in fashion you're not supposed to look womanly, because clothing, you know, is basically modeled on prepubescent 14-year-olds. So this, you know, I would never think of Grace Kelly as being a hippie woman, but it really embraces curves, and that exquisite draping is phenomenal. So who likes shoes here? Okay. Well, that is a shoe. So this is Louboutin before Louboutin on Betty Page. I mean, think about how that shoe, that we fetishize shoes so much today. But Betty Page understood that 50 years before shoes became $1,000, and a woman invested in shoes and bought fast fashion at H&M or Zara to sort of, you know, balance this high-low look. You know, people think of Betty Page as being so provocative. There's incredible innocence to her face. This sort of lingerie provocative moment, but to me, like, I think this is a Louboutin ad. This is what inspires every shoe designer. This is what inspires women. Like, you buy the great shoe. So this is a Chanel. You know, Chanel sort of disappeared for a little bit during the war. Some say that during World War II she aided and abetted the Nazis, but she did return thereafter, and you can see that this Chanel look is so incredibly modern, and that is the profoundness of what I think Chanel did, probably more so than any other designer, but everything she did has a relevance today. I mean, to me, like, this could be, if you turn that skirt into a pant, it could be an Armani suit. It could be a Calvin Klein suit. So I love the effortlessness of the image. So Balenciaga, incredible designer. I mean, talk about an interesting brand that was resurrected. I mean, Balenciaga. This is Balenciaga in the 1950s. It's romantic. There's a great devotion to Balenciaga's Spanish heritage. I mean, now, did you guys pay attention to the most recent Balenciaga shows? Designed by the man who brought us Vêtements. Now it's looks like craft work. It's so interesting how some brands are resurrected and really it's just about the name and less so about the historic DNA of the brand. I think even when Nicolas Ghesquière was designing Balenciaga, it had a very modern attitude, although he would do these archival reeditions. But that's incredibly romantic. I think the color story is gorgeous. Also, I love the image. I love the Celadon wrap. That's the other thing. Nobody makes wraps anymore. What do women do? You go to an event and you're in, you don't want to wear a heavy coat or a trench coat, so somebody could make a fortune just doing a wrap business and opera coats. So 1960s, probably the most quintessential 1960s image to me are the Pucci prints. Now, they were signed Emilio because Emilio Pucci was a count, and his family didn't approve of him going into the fashion business, so he signed everything Emilio. But these incredible prints, the incredible color stories are still so influential today. There's always a psychedelic fashion moment that plays around with a little Pucci. So Monica Vitti in the 1960s, she's wearing what I call the 80s Slimane look, the sort of shrunken jacket, the white collar shirt, she's smoking a cigarette. This is, I think, a very classic way for a 21st century woman to dress. And at the same time, we think about what Peggy Moffitt and Rudi Gernreich did. We talked about Poiret and his wife, and Adrian with Joan Crawford, these beautiful collaborations. There never was a more genius collaboration between model and muse than Rudi Gernreich and Peggy Moffitt. And I mean, I'm partial. I curate the Rudi Gernreich exhibition. That all comes from the closet of his model and muse, Peggy Moffitt, and the imagery is all shot by Peggy's late husband, William Claxton. So there was this amazing collaboration of modernity, and so much of what Gernreich did, he doesn't get credit for. He was really the first to do military, serious military in clothing before Yves Saint Laurent. He was the first to do sheer before Yves Saint Laurent. It's always credited to Yves Saint Laurent. He created probably the most iconic fashion image of the 20th century, which is the topless swimsuit, which I think is really the birth of modern fashion. He created the thong. I mean, who's got a thong on? I mean, I know there's a bunch of bras. You've got the thong on, I can tell. The pubikini, I mean, the mixed media, unisex clothing, these were all things done by Rudi Gernreich. Interestingly enough, he was LA-based designer. He was an Austrian immigrant who came to America during the war, and he was also very involved with the Mattachine Society, so he was a very early gay rights advocate, I mean, in the 1940s and 50s. So he was an incredibly progressive thinker. So this is a Donald Brooks dress. When I talk about the power of the back, I love this dress because we've had it in the store before. It was actually a dress that you can play around with the strapping of it. It's got sort of there's a kind of a James Bond moment going on here, but a nice bold earring. Again, you can't go wrong with a great black dress, great bold earring. I wish more women dressed like this at the Emmys and Globes and tried a little less hard. Everyone tries so hard. That's the sad thing that's happened to the red carpet today, is that it's very calculated. It's very studied. There was in the beginning of decades, it still was a little free. So this is Twiggy and everything from Pierre Cardin to Paco Rabanne to Rudi Gernreich. I love the mix of the designers, and I think that idea of mixing brands and the liberation of styling yourself, that you don't have to wear one brand head to toe. And everyone likes a good factory girl. amazing cultural impact. Everybody wants to be Edie Sedgwick. Or wants to be Talitha Getty. You know, we talk about all of those hippie moments. We saw them in 1900 and 1910. It happens over and over again. And here's another image of Rudi Gernreich. What I think is so interesting about this image is that it's so, the color blocking, the saturation, the bold prints, even the way the models look. This is a 1960s image. It looks like today. You could wear something like that today with a pair of great gladiator sandals and look fantastic. So now we're going to the 70s. This is a close-up of a James Galanos image. You know, we saw the Madame Grey pleating. It continues that goddess dressing. So remember that image in 1910 with the interesting wallpaper and the couch? So see how it kind of happens again. This is Ossie Clark, one of the great British designers, largely forgotten. I'm very proud that Decades was one of the places that really resurrected his name, because we had a huge exhibition of his clothing in maybe it was 2001 or something like that. But Ossie Clark dressed all the stars. And he was like Tom Ford before Tom Ford. He was so part of that circle dressing. Bianca Jagger. One of the things I always say about Ossie Clark is that he dressed a lot of the stars' wives because they were always pregnant and breastfeeding. And he made these dresses out, the breast was very easy access. So I think his clothes were brilliant. He, like so many great artists, sadly died penniless. He was actually murdered by a lover of his, but at the time that this picture was taken, he was married to the textile designer Celia Birtwell. So this is American chic. I mean, Cheryl Tiegs. I actually took her to the Met Gala when they did Model as a Muse, the exhibition. She was my date, and I think she just turned 69 2 days ago or something like that. This is sort of like the beginning of athleisure, because athleisure is all we hear about now in fashion. But Cheryl Tiegs, and we were really talking as I got to know Cheryl. She was very athletic, and the way she dressed was incredibly influential. I mean, certainly her posters sold like crazy. Her Sports Illustrated covers were hugely popular. But it is that athleisure moment before we even know about it. I mean, this is before Jane Fonda's workout. And speaking of Bianca Jagger, this is, you know, that classic, amazing white suit, the beautiful Tiffany Peretti, incredible sculptural bangle. I've had the pleasure of being at several events with Bianca Jagger recently. I mean, she's become an incredible human rights activist. But it's like she was amazing, so super stylish. This is a perfect way of dressing. And you know, again, we're talking about shoes. This is a great Guy Bourdin image for Charles Jourdan. I've always found it fascinating that John Travolta's placement in the picture, because I think the last thing he wants to do is to be looking up her skirt, but that's a whole nother story. But Guy Bourdin is one of my favorite photographers. I think his images were incredibly provocative and modern, and this is an example of that. I mean, these were shoe advertisements, but they're spectacular. So I had to have a little Halston in the book because, you know, I'm like the face of Halston. So this is Beverly Johnson, the first African-American woman to appear on the cover of Vogue. And Beverly told me when this dress was made, it was basically draped on her. So this was made precisely for her. Do you remember what Lupita Longo wore to the Oscars, the Prada dress? Hello, same dress. You know, but more or less. Beautiful dress. Beverly did not get to keep the dress, sadly. Little Yves Saint Laurent image, you know, again, le smoking, little mysterious. The hat, I mean, hats are so popular again. So 1980s, this is a detail of Christian Lacroix for Jean Patou from a collection that was completely canned because Lacroix was sued by Patou for getting funding to start his own brand. So I got a lot of the pieces when they came out of an archive several years later. So the power suit, also the power blush and the mullet haircut, and all these things I really don't like, but they represent the 80s. And that power suit is coming back. Pay attention to what's happening in fashion. You're seeing this is back. It's back in a different way because the lipstick isn't kind of purple and the hair's not so severely kind of bleached and it's not, the mullet is what really ruins it for me. But I think the idea of this sort of power suit, this idea of dressing as women were kind of breaking the glass ceiling, thought they had to dress in a kind of a masculine way. So now the power suit is a little bit different looking. So I've always thought this was a very interesting image taken at the Christian Dior Atelier of a Marc Bohan dress, the pink dress, and kind of looking down at that bar jacket. In a sense, there was a time when I think a new designer came into a brand and not necessarily didn't want to pay respect, but almost looked down at the past. It's really changed quite a bit. Although not every designer wants to pay homage to the past, they certainly celebrate the past. But I've always thought it's sort of like this profound juxtaposition from the past and to the future. So remember when we saw that beautiful Fortuny dress, also on the couch with the wonderful wallpaper. This is Tina Chao, who really, I think, kind of started the love of vintage collecting. We lost her to AIDS very, very early in the crisis, but she was a great avid collector. So she is wearing Fortuny. She's wearing, in the 80s, a dress that's 60 years old. And one of my favorite muses is always Debbie Harry. I mean, is there a season that we don't see a Debbie Harry moment on the runway? And God bless Debbie Harry. She's still touring and playing and looks awesome. But this is Debbie Harry and Stephen Sprouse. So we talk about bodycon dressing. I mean, Kardashians. I mean, that's ass. Like, that's Jamie Lee Curtis. The idea that this fixation we have on butt, which is, such a Kardashian thing, it really has existed for more than, keeping up with the Kardashians. And again, talking about backs, this is Azzedine Alaïa. The dress is perfect. If there's one designer I would say everyone should buy retail because it never goes out of style, it's Alaïa, and of course a little Chanel. But the beauty of the back, we saw a variation of this dress in the 70s from Donald Brooks. So we're seeing this celebration of the front and the back. And this is Patrick Kelly. Like Mamboche in the 1940s, Patrick Kelly was a Southern African-American man who came to Paris and created an exuberance on the runway and in fashion with this sort of joie de vivre that I think no one has replicated until Jeremy Scott when he first came to Paris 15 years ago. So, it was about mixes of cultures and skin tones and fabulous fashion, but he could dress Betty Davis or he could dress Pat Cleveland. So that was the beauty of what Patrick Kelly did. And we think about, the opera coat. This is Yves Saint Laurent Couture. This is drama. This is movement. I think it's just spectacular and beautiful, and I wish more people offered clothing like this for women. This is also something that everyone can wear. Everyone gets to have a couture moment. I mean, if you're going somewhere. I don't know if you're going to wear it to Whole Foods, but whatever. Incredible Terry Mugler, the autoerotica of his design. Beyonce, about a year ago, borrowed some of these Mugler pieces. I mean, Mugler has had a renaissance again as a brand, and I think they've kind of figured out how to play around with the architecture and sort of, not necessarily architecture, but the manufacture of Terry Mugler. But at the same time, in the 80s, we have very political fashion. This is Catherine Hamnett, Stay Alive in '85. I had this shirt. I wish I still had it. I bought all the Catherine Hamnett slogan T-shirts that came out in the mid-'80s. I mean, she was a fashion designer who used the runway to make a statement. We see that a lot more right now. So this is Comme des Garçons, the idea of deconstructed fashion. You pay a lot of money for holes. You know, I bought a flannel shirt at Neiman's the other day that's all like kind of beat up. And it's like, why am I paying so much money for a shirt that I could just do myself? But the Japanese designers like Rei Kawabuko for Comme des Garçons or Issey Miyake or Yohji Yamamoto had all seen Hiroshima. And I think that deconstruction, this apocalyptic way of fashion, had an incredible impact. And Comme des Garçons is another example of a brand that I think never goes out of style because it's its own kind of DNA and vernacular. And again, this is Stephen Sprouse. It's kind of the beginning of heroin chic. I mean, this is Kate Moss before Kate Moss, this sort of way of dressing, this anti-glam. This is Terry Mugler again, the rainbow dress. For those who saw Katy Perry's Prism tour, this was the dress on the poster from Decades. So this is Lil' Kim, and there's a lot of her showing, because this is what really happened to fashion. It became logofied. It became so branded. We wear our brands on our sleeve, on our collar, on our wrist, on our person. And although there's moments where like logos come and go, they sort of are perennial. I think it's so interesting with the Gucci revival, and now they've got this Gucci ghost, this sort of a designer in New York, an artist in New York, who's basically creating street art with the Gucci logo, was invited to actually collaborate with Alessandro Michele on real Gucci. So there's even a bag that he did that says real in kind of fluorescent spray paint Gucci. So I think that we are logo obsessed. It's not going to go away. There may be moments when we're interested in a more subtle or sober moment in fashion, but at the end of the day, you know, a Louis is a Louis. So this is Patricia. Oh my God, why am I having a senior moment? It's coming to me. No, Patricia. I got my friend who's a costume designer for Sex and the City. Yes. Pat Fields. It's because I said Patricia. I gave her such a formal name. So this is Pat Fields styling, you know, famously for Sex and the City. Sex and the City more or less created the designer shoe moment, created the idea of shoe designers having a household name. But she was also very famous for playing around with vintage and modern in the 90s, when it wasn't really socially acceptable to wear something used. She wasn't scared of it. So if you ever look at images of Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, they are so timeless. I think it's really like fascinating. I always, you know, will kind of will reference her, but it's just this personification of 90s timeless dressing that I think has really been appropriated by brands like The Row that kind of play around with this minimalism. She wore Yohji, she wore Jill Sander. She, of course, was a great supporter of Calvin Klein because she worked there. But brilliant imagery that's completely timeless. So this is Cindy Crawford in, you know, what is really still the bodycon dress. This is how Kardashians dress. I mean, this is how every 16-year-old wants to go to prom wearing like a little bodycon dress. This is Gaultier, but it could be Hervé Leger, it could be Alaya. This is really a fascinating silhouette that emerges in the 90s that hasn't gone away. Like, we cannot get rid of this silhouette. And here's a little Kate Moss in a perfect body stocking. I mean, this is a woman. Think about how long she's been famous, how profound her impact will have on our culture and her style. And I love this great, you know, the supermodels. You've got Helena and you've got Cindy and we've got, well, yes, Lid. Can you name all your models? Yes, exactly. So I had to get, you know, when you get into the 90s imagery, you're putting a book together, you actually have to get approval from the people in the image. So, you know, we got approval from everybody. One person I was waiting for was Linda, and sent her a little email, and she was on a yacht, and she's like, "Of course, honey, you can run my photo." But I love the imagery here, these mixes of patterns. Also, this is when women looked like women on the runway. I mean, they were curvy and sexy. And I don't know if anyone got to see the Isaac Mizrahi exhibition at the Jewish Museum in New York. It's really very, very good. I mean, Isaac and I are colleagues and friends, but I took a young friend of mine to see it, and there's a lot of footage of his runway shows from the mid to late 90s. And one thing my friend Scott said is like, wow, the models look so old and they look so distinctive. It was a time period where you were celebrated for looking a little different and looking like a woman. I mean, it's very, very different. And I thought that was such an interesting observation because he had never seen these 90s models working at that time. So Tom Ford for Gucci, so super collectible today. This dress, I think, retailed for maybe $2,200 back in its day. It probably could command almost $20,000 today. I mean, and this is, 96 or 97. It's right about the time Decades opens. It plays around with some inspiration from both Rudi Gernreich and Halston, but it's just, a perfect white column dress that has this incredible hardware. At the same time in the 90s, we're seeing more deconstruction. The great Antwerp designers get more and more famous. This is Anne de Meulemeester. Did you notice on the runways recently how many off-the-shoulder jackets and blouses are being shown? And it's really interesting how this look, just in the last 2 weeks, has been all over the runways. And this is Narciso Rodriguez, beautiful, simplistic silhouettes, crop top, little belly-bearing skirt, 90s American minimalism. And then we go into the Decades decade, the first decade of the 21st century, which I really call the Decades decade because everything is vintage inspired. Here is my friend Marissa Tomei and YSL for Christian Dior at a gala and looking perfect, always been a great Decades patron. I mean, this is all modern fashion in this modern editorial, but it looks like Haight-Ashbury. But this is all current clothing of the decade. And this was something Pat Field sent me because I asked her for an archival image. I said it before, Sarah Jessica Parker really helped women and men fall in love with fashion designers. But she also recognized the power of what fabric does. There's that cliche that the fabric of our lives about cotton, but it really does mean something. So she was getting ready, Sarah Jessica, to film this final scene for the series of Sex and the City. And Pat took this photo of her putting it on and feeling the fabric to get into character. And I think we're all getting into character. We're all basically wearing a little bit of drag. Some days you've got your boho moment, some day you got your military moment, but it's all about, it's feelings. Fashion is powerful. And as fashion has become more and more global, this is a Bottega Veneta image. They just celebrated their 50th anniversary. This is Thomas Meyer. Again, you see that classic silhouette, the beautiful halter, the movement of the clothing, and of course, we've gone to Asia because it's become a very important consumer resource. And finally, the woman I think who keeps fashion exciting in the 21st century is Dita Von Teese, who I think really has brought back a unstudied glamour. I love about Dita is that she often does her own hair and makeup. She's been a vintage aficionado forever. She, is got this cape on, so we talk about the abaya. We've seen variations of capes from the past. So I love that she's made vintage glamour appropriate. And always kind of my challenge to everybody is like, don't be afraid to dress up. It's okay. Like, I love running around in my yoga, in my Lulus, and that's, in a pair of Birkenstocks. But every time I do that, let me tell you, I run into someone really important, and they're seeing too much of my business. So my challenge to everybody is like, don't be afraid to dress up.